Professor Yang is a PhD at Princeton University and is a William Claude Rivas Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where he's been teaching for more than 20 years. Yeah. He holds a number of leadership positions, both inside and outside the university. He's founding director, or founding faculty member of the University of Chicago's Beijing Center. He's former director of the Asian Institute at the University of Singapore. He's a senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's on the advisory board of the Chicago Pulse Institute. He's a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which is the organization that has sponsored our event tonight. In fact, he's on the Committee of 100 at the National Committee, which recognizes extraordinary Chinese Americans for their contributions in their fields. In short, he is the ideal person to come to an event like this tonight, which aims to let us all learn more about China. So look forward to his presentation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yang to Hall.
This is my favorite picture of China. In many ways, partly because you look at these 7 men, and they are all men. They are members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee. It's a mouthful, but they are the 7 most powerful men, in fact. And you can see they probably have the same tailor. In fact, they virtually have the same tie, with one exception. That picture, the painting behind them actually has appeared typically every 5 years or so. They appear before that painting. And people have actually put some effort into interpreting that painting as well. Because what does it mean to have the most powerful people in China standing in front of a mountain range? Right? It's not simply one mountain. You don't see a peak. Right? There are multiple peaks really in this. It's rock solid, but as is typical of the image of Chinese leadership, it simply speaks to the fact that there are 7 powerful men. And this is actually what most people thought that they were getting in China when you have 7 people. In fact, before 2012, at the end of 2012, there were 9 men. One of the 9 actually now is in jail, by the way. But the point is, historically, from the 1990s until 2012, essentially we have a situation of the top leaders in China, each holding a particular portfolio, and generally having control mostly over that particular portfolio. Chinese politics has changed quite a bit over the last 2 or 3 years as a result. So has the economy, and of course the economy, I want to begin with this one chart. And it's a striking chart, in fact, because it essentially says, you go back to around 1990, China was neck to neck with India in per capita GDP. And you can see also how it has changed since then, because per capita GDP in China is remarkable. It's actually sort of 5 times as much as in India. And that's truly, especially given the time period we are talking about, in 2 decades' time, the massive transformations that have occurred in China, and at the same time, the challenges India has faced in the process. And as a result, recently, for example, President Xi just came to visit the United States. So did Prime Minister Modi from India. Of course, there are significant contrasts. Prime Minister Modi is a much better leader into the interacting with the Indians, especially he went to Silicon Valley. More than 10,000 people showed up at the stadium. But in terms of actual influence, is President Xi, who gets a state banquet, is all the trappings of a formal state visit to Washington, D.C., with 21-gun salute. It speaks a lot to the contrast, to the weight that China has today in the global economy and on other matters, but also the systemic, the regime differences between China and India as a result, actually. And of course, that shows a variety of aspects, whether it's the share of global exports and imports, and of course in terms of the amount of foreign exchanges that China holds. And of course, this is a more historical chart that some of you know, and it actually shows the Chinese contribution to global GDP growth over time. And as you can see, China's contribution has been very substantial in recent decades, in fact. I want also to give you another figure which we don't tend to emphasize in such talks, in fact, because what is money if you don't get to live a good, healthy life? Right? So when you think about it, this is actually really what matters in many ways. And it's actually this figure on life expectancy. Those are World Bank numbers, in fact. As you can see, Japan actually is remarkable in many ways. It began to surpass the United States in the late 1960s, and of course continues to have a higher life expectancy than in the United States. But what's interesting is China, after the famine around 1960, after it began to recover from the famine, Chinese life expectancy has finally begun to increase. Incidentally, many of you reading the news probably saw that one of the Nobel Prize winners for medicine and physiology is a Chinese scientist, a woman, one of only 12 so far have won the Nobel Prizes in medicine. Well, Nobel Prizes, in fact. And in fact, the work that she did is very important because this year's Nobel Prizes for medicine actually are about treating parasitic diseases. Those typically are diseases that affect the poor. In this case, in the case of the Chinese woman, Tuyoyo, it's about malaria. In fact, the great irony is actually a byproduct to some extent of the Vietnam War, because during the Vietnam War, China was supporting Vietnam, northern Vietnam, against the United States, against southern Vietnam, and of course the United States. But in the process, the Vietnamese government, northern, came to the Chinese leaders asking for help because we have many soldiers suffering from malaria. So did many of the Chinese, the engineering corps and others working to Vietnam. In the process, in the 1960s and 70s, the Chinese leadership mobilized a lot of scientists to begin to look for a cure for malaria, and Tuyoyo was one of those. Actually, she was a very low-ranked scientist in the process. So there was a lot of debate about who should get credit for this major discovery. Eventually, in recent years, some scientists began to dig into this history. But what's most interesting is you think about this, actually, this discovery was done in the 1970s. And you can imagine many since then. In fact, we are talking about tens of millions of people who have benefited from this particular drug. It still remains the first-line defense against malaria. And in many ways, China already was beginning to improve in the 1960s and 70s in terms of public health and so on. And China continues to improve in recent years in terms of life expectancy. Here is another number. Again, not the typical number you think about when you talk about China, but it's a very important number: suicide. When we think of, if you want a window onto any society, a good way to think about it is actually the suicide rate. If you do a research comparing countries by the ranking of who have the highest suicide rates, many of the countries that rank very high on such a list are formerly communist countries. China used to be very high on this list. China also was distinguished because more women succeed in killing themselves than men, and especially in the countryside, and partly because with the family planning policies and strict limits on having numbers of children, in fact, many women got into trouble. If you have a girl, then you get a lot of pressure, and then of course sometimes sort of conflicts arise within families. And in the countryside, it's easy to gain access to pesticides and so on. But recently, social scientists have done some very interesting research, and they have found that in the last decade and a half, the suicide rate in China has dropped by almost 50%. And more importantly, Not only that, the trend of having more women kill themselves than men has also disappeared, mostly disappeared in China. Instead, China has become not only normal, but China's ranking has dramatically improved as a result. Part of the reason, again, it speaks, that's why I think actually this is a wonderful window in thinking in providing sort of a lens onto China's development. Because you think about China, the high rises, the fact that you have mobile phones, the way that you can travel, the individual today is liberated. The women who used to be kept at home in the countryside, didn't have a lot of opportunities today, that's no more. Increasingly people are liberated, they can go out, make their own living, and especially with improving labor conditions and so on. As a result, actually, they are also connected through the cell phone. In fact, more than 600 million people have smartphones today. As a result, again, it shows in those kind of numbers, and it's very, very interesting as a result. However, the challenge is this rapid growth has also produced some challenges, and one of them is inequality. Now, globally, of course, the percentage of people who are poor has declined in recent decades, but that's not the case in most countries, including in the United States and China. But China today actually ranks among one of the most unequal societies. I have here on this chart is very interesting. All the numbers essentially are Chinese numbers. But around, on the blue dots, so around this time, the Chinese government began to stop publishing those numbers. Why? Because the numbers kept on deteriorating. The National Bureau of Statistics decided to simply stop publishing that. In fact, if you are a scholar, you want income statistics. Until recently, you can gain access to income numbers for individual provinces. You cannot get the national numbers because anyone who gets the national data set can very quickly produce the Gini coefficient. So for many years, economists doing research on Chinese incomes couldn't gain more than a few provinces worth of data, in fact. But then, what's interesting is, researchers at a particular university in the southwest of China, with support from the People's Bank of China. Now this is very interesting. In China, every unit practically has some sort of formal or informal ranking. The ministries, of course, are ranked at the ministerial level. I'm sure many of you take classes, you learn about some of the operations of the institutions in China. A province in China is ranked at the ministerial level too. If you are equally ranked, you cannot order each other. Very interesting in this case. The National Bureau of Statistics is actually ranked at the vice ministerial level. The People's Bank of China is ranked at the ministerial level. So when this other university decided to do surveys of income, it had the support of the People's Bank of China, and therefore it could produce numbers. The NBS isn't happy, but it cannot simply shut it down. Right? So this is China in many ways. So as a result, now we have non-official numbers of incomes as well from the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics. It's around that time, suddenly also the National Bureau of Statistics began to release its numbers. In fact, and those are the little orange dots on the figures. What's interesting is they also emphasized how China, certainly the numbers seems to have stabilized. But it remains a major issue because when you combine income inequality with corruption and so on, it can become very combustible. And of course, there have been other issues too. And this is the bird's nest, and you can see the pollution is visible. And in fact, tonight in Beijing, the air is pretty bad at this very moment. In fact, pollution doesn't affect everybody equally. So this is a striking figure because it's actually plots the so-called cancer villages. Villages that have shown to have many more cancer sufferers than others. In fact, this photographer by the name of Lu Guang whom you can easily search out on the web, has taken some striking pictures of pollution in China around the country, and he's taken a picture of a village. Everyone in the picture, in fact, is known to have suffered from cancer. But there is one thing very important. You don't locate a polluting factory in the middle of Beijing. Usually the factory is further away, it will be moving away. So there is also, it's not simply income that's unequal, right? It's the suffering from pollution and so on that's also unequal as pollution increasingly moves to the fringes of the cities and outside of major cities as well. In fact, out of sight, and of course, the government doesn't tend to focus so much on it. But it's when you have the bad air in Beijing, even the top leaders, the top 7, cannot escape from them. They may install air purification machines. They do. The brand is called Broad. It's one of the leading sort of appliance companies in China, in the world, in fact. But even they cannot escape from the bad air. So when you have the air apocalypse in 2013 and 2014, it gets attention. The middle class begin to worry about Beijing. They want to leave Beijing. Suddenly begin to have a national movement, right? So sort of as a result today, we have actually a much more significant development with new laws on the environment and so on. As a result. And likewise, there are a lot of other issues that have been happening. Rising property prices may be great, but if it's too high, then not only do the younger people find it difficult to afford housing in the cities, but also increasingly factories cannot afford the land, and so on. So you see, in this context, that a lot of the challenges have arisen in China. Because China has grown rapidly, not simply because the people are industrious and all that, it's also because China had a system that, for example, provided not only cheap labor, but also cheap land. And part of the reason is because the government today owns, de facto, the state owns all the land, except in rural areas, is owned by the collective. And this is the legacy of the Communist Revolution. Land was actually taken over by the state. But it actually made it much easier to build a highway. Try to build a highway. I mean, before the Olympic Day, there was some talk about building another rapid transit to the airport, and in Chicago, I think there was some talk, but the idea disappeared. Nobody is trying, and trying to expand our air is difficult in here. In China, however, you can build gleaming airports every few years. In Beijing, actually, they have gigantic airport today. It's already filling up to capacity, and the city is building another one, larger actually, so they can take the land very easily. You can easily build highways. You can easily also build apartment buildings. There is one catch. The catch is only the state has the right to obtain the land, to requisition the land from farmers. And there is another catch. Now, in our Constitution of the United States, there are two things. There is the property clause that allows the federal government to own a lot of the national parks and so on, 150 million acres of them. So that's why we have the national parks. But we are actually pretty much immune from private trespassing in terms of damaging them. On the other hand, we also have the takings clause. The takings clause allow that if you want to take land, take property from the private interest, you have to pay fair competition. Right? It's very important because that provides for the protection of property rights in the United States. In China, the law, the regulations allow for the government to take the land, but compensate the farmers only for the original purposes to which the land was used for. In other words, if you grow crops, you are compensated for the crops, but crops are not worth a whole lot. Right? As a result, the cities around the country in China actually build a lot of high-rises, but they don't just build the high-rises. They take the land on the cheap, then, of course, convert them into commercial land, auction them off, and make a lot of money in the process. And then you build high rises, you build commercial establishments, and of course income taxes and other things begin to arrive. And that's the way you develop. There is a lot of incentive to develop. And by the way, if you're the mayor, you not only want to develop the city, you probably also want to have some friends and others to do some of the projects. Because properties, you can't easily build properties. You need a lot of regulations to be regulatory approvals and all that. Who have the access to those approvals? Again, you need the kind of political collateral access. And that's where it's not only, remember, the land is being taken on the cheap, but also that people have access to sort of those kind of land takings happen, but also corruption happen. But of course, over time, people learn that my land is being taken cheaply. And they decided that this is their opportunity. And of course, property too, sometimes in other areas, properties are also being taken over. And then gradually, a lot of people around the country begin to protest. In fact, today we are talking about several hundred major mass protests around the country every day. So sort of you have seen this kind of increases in terms of the protests. And this is actually, in many ways, the political economy of China. Rapid growth, but also a lot of grievances because there are people who feel like they have been unfairly treated. Right? So sort of and this is the context within which the new generation of leaders came in and deciding that this way they're going to get into trouble. The Communist Party cannot sustain its legitimacy. Growth is not enough. You need growth, but also you need to deal with issues such as income inequality, but especially corruption. And as a result, these kind of, to ease the kind of sentiments that people have felt that they are sort of wrapped in fear. So this is actually the kind of situation with Xi. Today you go around, Xi has launched major campaigns around the country. He's established his leadership with the military, he's launching major military reforms. He's built a Central National Security Commission whereby he really gains control over the internal security apparatus, but also over the military. Most importantly, he's also made a very, very serious effort to discipline the party by installing very, very strict norms on, for example, bankers. Use of official cars for private uses essentially has been banned. So you can lose your job for using official cars. And increasingly, government officers are auctioning off their official fleet at this moment. But at the same time, cracking down on dissent. But most interestingly is the fact that they've also lowered the expectation on the economy a little bit, but at the same time launched a war on corruption. As a result, it actually even though suicide rates for ordinary people have declined in China, the suicide rate for officials has dramatically gone up, in fact, in China. And of course, when you are shoring up your own control, your own power, what's best to use then to make a little bit of use of nationalism? So Xi is standing tall, trying to take on Japan on the East China Sea, and of course, staking Chinese claims in the South China Sea, and so on, in this case. But at the same time, he's been offering various goodies, including modifying the population policy a little bit, and I think there should be additional modifications fairly soon. So here are some pictures in terms of he's going around with people, visiting the branches of the military, for example, conferring generalships, and so on. And of course, this is one of his most popular moves was to offer a steamed dumpling shop, and of course this particular brand has truly gone very popular in many ways. So that's the kind of situation that China has, that Xi has. He's also launched, of his leadership, has come out with two major documents. One emphasizing how to let market forces play a decisive role in the economy, and the other one, in fact, promoting law-based governance. But at the same time, there have been a lot of contradictions. Recently, people have been very disappointed with the new document on state enterprise reforms. Especially, it doesn't seem to say that there should be decisive moves, for example. The law-based governance idea is great. In fact, no country can become developed without the rule of law. Yet, in recent months in particular, the Chinese state has arrested and detained several hundred, more than 200 actually, so-called veteran lawyers or rights defense lawyers. Let's keep in mind, every lawyer is a rights defender in many ways because that's what they do. They have to do. But in this particular case, the government has actually cracked down on some of the most outspoken lawyers, although most of them have been released so far, enough of them have not been in that. So there have been some contradictions. I think people are still watching what is Xi trying to do. The defenders of Xi emphasize that he needs the powers, he needs to crack down on dissent so that he can continue to promote the reform agenda. Others think actually he may be at the bottom of his heart is more of someone who grew up in the Mao era. And I think actually maybe it's actually sort of a mixture in some ways. His generation tends to be more nationalistic. But at the same time, one of the key advisors for him is his daughter, who actually is promoting Xi on WeChat and other social media, who actually has a degree from among other places, Harvard. So it's a very interesting situation in that regard. So here is actually Mr. Wang Qishan, a buddy of his from their youth, and who has been spearheading is a decisive reformer who's been leading the anti-corruption drive, in fact. So let me end with this list of people who have already ended up in jail and so on, and many others, in fact, in terms of the tigers that have been caught. In fact, for those who are concerned about the oceans and about the environment, used to be people considered the, in fact, sort of the shark fin soup as delicacy. But with Mr. Xi, they have banned the consumption of shark fin soup for official banquets. As a result, the consumption of shark fins has declined by something like 70%. Practically. So if there is a great silver lining, that's a very nice development, certainly. So let me pause here, and I'll open for questions and comments. Yeah, the gentleman over here. Please do say a word or two about yourself.
I'm James. Professor Wang, do you believe that social trust is growing in some places in localities in China? Is there evidence of that?
Well, the social trust issue is a big issue. In fact, social scientists tend to emphasize having a fairly good degree of trust, especially trust among strangers. Right? People in traditional cultures in China, they trust their own family. They want to get money for their families and so on. That doesn't count as much. I mean, it counts, but it's not enough. The best modern economists tend to emphasize that you need interpersonal trust. And there is a question, especially from the General Social Survey, which is a survey that's done today in more than 40 countries, has been done for over 40 years. There is the question, do you think most people can be trusted? It turned out actually among the Chinese, the level of trust is quite high. And I think that's very important. For all the complaints about China, how there are fakes and other things, the Chinese people tend to trust others, generally speaking. In fact, there are various issues. And I think that's one of the most interesting developments in terms of thinking about economic growth in China, that people are willing to do deals. But they do deals very differently. I mean, you heard already the discussion on the TPP, but there are a lot of complaints about the TPP, about China's behavior in the global trading system. Part of the issue is the view on contracts is very different in China compared to the US. Here we want, when you have a contract, you do a real estate deal or something, you want everything to be written out. The Chinese tend to say, let's write the agreement, but it doesn't have to be very complex. But it's after you sign the agreement, suddenly that they come back and say, oh, could this be changed? Could that be changed? But you view this, it's a relationship. So the negotiation, sometimes there is the saying that the negotiation only starts after the agreement is signed. But overall, though, I think actually what's interesting is the level of trust in China has been quite high, and even adjusting, because there have been some questions about how trustful can we trust the numbers on Chinese trust, so to speak. In fact, it turned out after adjusting for what's known as the radius of trust, the trust levels in China remain quite high. So that's what's interesting, and so you should read into some of the literature if you haven't. You don't have a question?
No.
Okay.
I actually have a question about trust as well, and that is trust in the regime or in the party itself. You know, because as you mentioned, China faces a lot of problems: pollution, corruption, inequality. But for a long time, the party's faced these problems and other problems. And what's always struck me is that there's always been a great deal of faith in the central government leadership, right? That there's a strong belief that we have these problems, but we've got a party that's capable and dedicated to solving the central leadership. They may not like the local leadership so much sometimes, but the central government is highly trusted. Has that changed, or is that level of trust still quite high? And, you know, I'm trying to get a sense of like the impact, for example, of Xi's anti-corruption campaign.
Yeah, this is one of the most striking contrasts. Because in the US, if you ask, do you trust the Congress or the president's popularity reading is 48% or so. Congress was as low as 16%, in fact, although we trust our legislators individually. So that's the paradox we have had. In the surveys on political trust in China, trust in the central government has been extraordinarily high. They are in the 90s, actually, so sort of. In the local governments, however, it's much lower. Still it's in the 60s or something like that. I've done some research, for example, in terms of whether it's perceptions of pollution or land takings. If you have your land taken by the local authorities, you tend to be less trusting of the local government. Man tends to trust the local governments less. So there are a variety of patterns here. I think this continues to be debated. The trust in the central government cannot be held so high as at more than 90% all the time. There has to be something to be discounted. But why is it so? I think there are a variety of factors. Number one, the system in China is more like the EU, but it's different from the EU. The EU is more like a regulatory state. But the individual countries, however, the parliaments and the national leaders are elected by the people. In China, in fact, you have at the basic level, the village leaders are elected, the local people's congress members are elected. The mayors, however, they are not directly elected, but they do need approval officially from the local people's congresses. The national leaders are not elected directly by the people, definitely. But there is something very interesting. The interesting thing is increasingly the central government in China has become a regulator, regulating the local authorities. But it also has a lot of advantages. Number one, the media can be censored. The Communist Party has the Central Propaganda Department. Every day, it directs a lot of people to say, well, let's do this. Let's try to direct public opinion in such a way. For example, don't criticize democracy directly. Nowadays, actually, they're saying, don't criticize democracy directly. But try to say how democracy is not solving the problems, that why democracy is not doing this right, and all that. And especially, so they have various ways of channeling opinion. And they have hundreds of thousands of people in China across the country posting on the internet and so on doing this, not to mention the official media. More importantly, in the official media, you cannot simply criticize Xi. If you do, your comments would disappear, and you will end up in trouble. Online, no, you can't. Yeah, your postings would disappear. So therefore, this is what I call truncated media freedom. If you criticize the local leaders, in fact, I know of people who practically can seek ransoms from local leaders because the local leaders don't like to be criticized. But they can't shut up everybody. Then they have to spend money to actually sort of go around online to get the postings to be removed. So there are reporters in China who would write up a report on enterprise or on local leader and then say, I've written this, so what do you think? And then the other side realizes that this is a guy, and some of the reporters really do bad things in China, because they think that there's a lot of censorship, so I can do some of that too. So therefore, they are paid off not to publish. And of course, sometimes in the form of advertisements. Recently, some of the leading newspapers in China have been found to be liable for that. So you can criticize local authorities, you can't criticize central authorities. The center, every time there's a problem, it's the local authorities' problem. Also, even though, remember, the land takings clause in China is a national regulation, but the local people blame the local authorities for taking their land on the cheap, not because they think that the central government did something wrong. Right? Likewise, in the case of there was recently a massive explosion with a lot of actually sort of deadly poisons in the city of Tianjin. Again, eventually it's the local leadership that comes out to accept responsibility. So everything that goes wrong usually is the local leader, with exceptions, of course. Typically, the national leaders rarely are wrong, and until recently they are practically off limits, except for Mr. Zhou Yongkang, the former internal security czar. He's behind bars. But part of the issue that he got into trouble is also that he wasn't really, he and others were thinking about maybe Mr. Xi wasn't good enough, that maybe he should be replaced. Of course, then he was found to be corrupt and ended up behind bars and so on. So there is this big issue. So I tend to want to discount the trust in the central leadership. But overall, though, when you have a country that has such rapid growth for more than 30 years, typically, generally, they tend to get a lot of credit. So even in most regimes, if you have a rapid growth with significant improvements in incomes and living standards, the level of trust should be fairly high. In the Chinese case, of course, we do see this divergence. But overall, though, the level of trust, political trust, is pretty high. But the challenge for the leadership is they realize they cannot rely on the economic growth anymore just to generate as much trust. So therefore, they're cracking down on corruption. They're trying to deal with pollution. They're dealing with a variety of quality of life issues. President Xi Jinping has, for example, mentioned that if we can't even deal with the issue of food safety properly, then people may raise the question, are they qualified to stay in power? So they do have an awareness of the importance of legitimacy.
So my name's Luke. Do you find that because of the crackdowns and also because of the scapegoating in blaming local politics, is there sort of a souring of relationship between the local politicians and the central government?
I think at this point it's not simply souring. Let's keep in mind every local official, they have ties, they have a lot of things, but with the rules governing official behavior, the most prudent way at this point is not to act rashly. Right? Officials want to stay in power until they decide that it's not worth it to stay in power. And there are some people who have quit government positions in recent months. But overall, though, most officials want to wait it out. And it used to be if they were promoting a certain development project, they can get the economy growing. But if in the process you make a lot of people unhappy, then they may be protesting. You can get trouble for causing instability as well. What do? You proceed a little more slowly, right? Why do you have to rush in this process? So actually, they are much more adamant in recent months about cracking down, dealing with the environment than to promote economic growth, and especially when you have a lot of properties in the third and fourth tier cities. Likewise, the easy hanging fruits are not there anymore in terms of other industrial projects and so on. So in that sense, at this particular moment, risk averse behavior is on. But that's actually only based on the most rational perspective that politicians want promotions and they want to stay in power. But let's also keep in mind, it used to be they would have relatives, they have their own family members setting up companies to do the development projects. Of course now, with all the anti-corruption rules, you want to be very cautious. That alone also is a significant factor in slowing down a lot of projects, because the personal drives, the incentives have also disappeared. Although I think actually there remains some, but overall though, officials are much more cautious today than before. So all of those taken into account, besides the fact that a lot of the fancy dining has disappeared, that alone can account for the luxury consumption. Conspicuous consumption is out in China. So therefore, that actually hurts a lot of the more luxurious aspect of consumption. But you go to restaurants, the mid-price restaurants in China, they are full of people actually, despite the dramatic fall in the stock markets and so on. It's in the luxury segment where it used to be a lot of official dining happens, that actually there has been a major downturn. Many restaurants have closed as a result.
So I think China doesn't have a stable policy environment, and I think the political environment is the key to keep economic development in China. So what do you think of the relationship between the political, like the government policies, and the economic development, and what do you think about the future in Chinese economic development?
Well, this is a major question. Of course, China has been able to provide a fairly stable environment for growth. In fact, the great irony of Chinese development is the Communist Party, which is supposedly the champion of workers, of labor, actually ensured until recently that labor has stayed cheap and also stayed peaceful for capital, if you think about it. So if you are Marxist, it's very ironic in many ways. But of course, as the labor force has changed, as the population growth has slowed, labor costs have risen dramatically in recent years. And of course, labor can demand more. So you can walk away today in China from a job and not be afraid of not finding another job in many sectors. For example, if every restaurant in Beijing, for example, is looking for waiters and waitresses, we can't fill enough of them at current prevailing rates, in fact. So stability, going back to the classical concerns, is extremely important. So that kind of stability. The challenge, however, is China, the system puts so much emphasis on ensuring stability, but sometimes by bottling up a lot of the grievances. So this is known as the stability maintenance system. And when you bottle up grievances, sometimes bad things happen. Like in the last few days, there was actually a massive series of explosions in the southern city in Guangxi. Some of you may have read about it. Actually, someone who was not very happy. Well, you can't easily buy guns in China, but explosives are relatively easy to come by. And they made sure many packages of explosives were sent out, actually. And of course, he personally apparently detonated some and practically destroyed entire buildings in the process, and killing quite a few people in the process. So I think the challenge for the leadership is how do you deal with those grievances, make the system fairer, more transparent, introduce greater stability. And the leadership has been trying to do that. In fact, for Premier Li Keqiang in particular, who has a law degree and economics degree, his motto has been to make the government more transparent and more efficient by reducing the number of approvals, by eliminating a lot of the approvals, in particular across the country, making it easier to get businesses set up. He's actually achieved some success so far. Now, one of the revolutionary developments that's being undertaken is what's known as the negative list. This is actually happening as part of the negotiations between the United States and China on a bilateral investment treaty. And in the process, because one of our complaints is that sometimes the behavior of the Chinese government is very hard to predict. Sometimes the local officials can be capricious. So the US and China are exchanging lists. What are this list? It's called a list of negatives, a list of what you should not do, or you cannot do. Why? Because if you know what cannot be done, then everything else that's not on the list can be done. And that's revolutionary. Why? Because until recently, the motto in China, including in the court of law, used to be you are guilty before unless you are found to be innocent. Right? That's very often how the government treats some people as well. So if you're under suspicion, you're in trouble. And governments, you know, not only the Chinese one, everywhere are so powerful vis-a-vis individuals. That's why we emphasize the importance of having a limited government based on the rule of law. In the Chinese case, actually so this is why I think this is potentially revolutionary. If you get this list of negatives to be introduced, then you know what you cannot do. Then you can say, oh, this is not on the list, therefore I can do it. So potentially this is very significant. It turned out actually in the process, the government in China has to know what it actually does. Turned out to be a very difficult undertaking, and the two governments have been working very, very diligently on this process. So there are a lot of reforms that are being introduced. They are not simply saying we need national elections, because the key, even for the US government, is we don't simply have a democratic government. We have a democracy based on a republican form of government and with the rule of law, such that actually our government, our constitution, guards against the tyranny of the majority. So for any country, therefore, what you need is, ideally, you want some form of liberal democracy, or certainly democracy, but also with the rule of law. And I think actually the challenge in building the rule of law is especially difficult for a government that actually doesn't have opposition and doesn't have a strong tradition in obeying the law. It's very challenging. So you're asking the most difficult question. China is making progress, but there are massive problems, and it takes a long time. Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, jokingly said, you need 5 centuries. You come back to the glorious revolution, is 4.5 or something like that. I think actually, hopefully, it doesn't require 5 centuries for China to move in that direction. But it does take a long time. And I think, remember, China had the Cultural Revolution during the Mao era. Essentially, it abandoned the constitution, the laws, and so on. And since then, since the late 1970s, China has been trying to recover the laws. And of course, it's a very difficult process as a result. And sometimes it requires some external constraint. Why did the Chinese leadership decide to join the WTO in 2001? Part of the reason was that they had tremendous difficulty in promoting domestic reforms. They decided if we join the WTO, we have to make those reforms by international agreement, and therefore we can force domestic interests to pursue certain reforms. Likewise, there's a lot of debate about the TPP, as you probably have heard. But already it's pushing the Chinese to think about what reforms do we have to do in order to catch up. So this will actually be a boost to reformers within China. Yeah, well, I can see. So we'll go through these 3. Okay, those are the last 3 questions. Therefore, yeah, go ahead.
I'm Tim. And I remember after seeing that question of the whole thing, the very low probability of military conflict between US and China, I guess it's a foreign policy question, but also considering what happened during Xi's visit with Obama and kind of like discussing these contentious issues, but not a whole lot going on. Do you feel like some of these certain issues, like especially considering the cyber attack, the whole cybersecurity issues and the maritime issues, and everything, do you feel like they will progress, or do you feel like we'll just kind of stay locked?
Well, let's put it this way. There are differences between the US and China. And it's vital the two countries stay engaged to discuss those issues. Because we cannot simply afford, those are two nuclear powers. It's not simply, if you think about nuclear powers, and especially nuclear powers with a significant arsenal and so on, war is unthinkable. And you go to read whether it's Kissinger and others, in fact, sort of. And what's interesting is, since the advent of nuclear weapons, those nuclear powers have largely been at peace with each other. They fight, but usually by proxy. They have not fought directly. It's very interesting because there is a doctrine that is associated with the University of Chicago. It's called the mutually assured destruction. If you know that you are going to be assured of destruction, if you attack the other side, you have a very strong interest not to do something, not to actually launch an attack. But the danger with major powers is there could be miscalculation, miscommunication, there could be simply an accident. Right? So that's why it's extremely important for powers, those powers to be engaged with each other. So yes, the visit by President Xi Jinping with President Obama did not produce fundamental breakthroughs. But let's keep in mind, they meet several times a year. They telephone each other, if not every month, certainly every couple of months. Our central bankers call each other very frequently, sometimes during the dead of night. The ministers and secretaries meet every half a year. We also have the strategic and economic dialogues. We have the Joint Commission on Economy and Trade. And we also have the bilateral dialogue, humanities exchanges, and so on. So the relationship between the United States and China is very thick. And if you really read carefully about the announcements, there are more than around 50 items whereby the two governments had agreements, including on cyber. No, we cannot hold China, we cannot guarantee that China will fully behave. But China had agreed in principle that that cyber attacks for economic espionage should not be encouraged. And that's actually a significant agreement in principle. There is also an understanding on military-to-military relationships so that two sides could actually communicate with each other. So there are many of those things happening on the environment, on technology, and so on. So the US and China actually, even when they get, and by the way, they also had a private meeting. We don't know what they talked about. They don't tell us, actually. So sort of, I think that's extremely important. So number one, the most important thing, first of all, is to mitigate differences, or manage the unpredictable aspects of the relationship. And then we can do certain things, including promoting interest for companies on both sides, and the companies on both sides are talking. And of course, the fact that Zuckerberg sat at the head table with President Xi is very interesting, because currently you cannot access Facebook from China directly without a VPN. You can use it with a VPN, but and there are more Chinese who are using a VPN. But let's also keep in mind, unlike in North Korea, China has blocked access to the New York Times or the Facebooks of the world. But in fact, there is a thriving internet sector in China as well, with the Alibabas and Baidus and so on. So it's not simply in the Chinese case that if you don't have Facebook, you have nothing. You don't have Facebook, you have WeChat. WeChat is a global phenomenon. You have the Weibo and so on. So in that sense, we need to keep that in mind as well. So I think actually this is a very, it's it's not a relationship that's very warm at this point. There are a lot of concerns, especially during an election season. But it's also a relationship that has a lot of stabilizing elements, in fact.
Yeah, so my name is Lei, so I'm question about she is doing his anti-corruption right now. So do you think he's really doing anti-corruption or he just wants to kick out his enemies and build his own leadership?
Well, the fact is, the incidence of corruption in China is very high, even though if you really look at numbers, the perception index for corruption has actually improved in China, except last year it did drop. I don't have it fully updated, in fact. But the point is, however, you can't fully separate the two at this stage, because so many officials are corrupt. But you cannot take out everybody. Therefore, you are always selective in such a circumstances. So judicial discretion is needed as a result. So in that sense, actually, he definitely wants to take out his enemies first. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that he's not fighting corruption, because those are corrupt officials as well. But no one fighting a corruption is going to try to say, I'm fighting everybody, because then you're in trouble. Right? So you have to be careful in finding a balance. But what's interesting is, increasingly, it's not simply about picking out specific individuals. It's also building institutions in terms of the roving inspections, in terms of online, you can do online whistleblowing and so on. So in that sense, it's really both. I think, I promised the last question.
Hi. Because of China's 2008 economic stimulus plan and the huge increase in debt within the country it's caused, do you think China's headed for its own financial collapse, the financial crisis?
Well, the issue is, that's a big one. Here is China's PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index. The PMI has been in recessionary conditions actually for 70 to 73 months. Prices on the Purchasing Managers Index have been declining, so there has been a significant slowdown in that regard, and this is certainly an issue. And of course, if you look at all the major indicators in terms of the infrastructure, whether it's cement or steel, electricity, they are not very bullish, certainly. So China's economy is slowing down, and of course it's leveraged, and especially for the state sector, the state-owned enterprises have especially taken on a lot of debt. Okay, so this is, well, if you are concerned about reform, this is a good thing, because we are forcing the state sector to slim down a little more. The private sectors actually are better managed as a result. But so this is the process. This means the Chinese economy has to slow down. There is another factor, that's the demographic factor. In the process, if you don't manage it well, it can cause a crash. For example, if the banks all recall the credit, everyone goes down, including the banks. In fact, sometimes it happens. We see banks rushing because I know the other banks are going to be recalling the loans. I want to be the first. Everyone wanting to be the first to recall the loans causes, of course, the one who has to repay the loans being unable to repay the loans altogether. It's a corrective action problem as a result. So the central government is aware of this. The People's Bank of China is beginning to allow local governments to issue more funds over time, and also to spread the debt out over time. If you can manage this over time, it can stabilize the process, because China still has construction to do in the cities when they build subways and so on. The real estate sector is a little bit problematic. It depends on the city. So we do have a challenge for China in this case. And of course, this slowdown means China's contribution to global growth will also slow down. But overall, though, this is potentially a manageable process. We do have a very competent leadership. But as we know, even the American Federal Reserve cannot prevent a Lehman kind of situation from spiraling into a major recession. In that sense, economists or central bankers have not fully learned to deal to avoid recessions. So something could still happen. At this point, the Chinese economy is growing, depending on your estimates. Officially, it's around 7%, but most people think it's much lower than that at this point. But of course, the good thing for China is the urbanization rate is still only a little more than 50%. So therefore, it's still got room to continue. The challenge is the number of young people is significantly lower. And all of those make the forecast for the economy a little more cloudy than before. The era, I think, of double-digit growth is over for China. The issue is, if you look at Japan, from the 1950s through the 1970s, it grew like China in the last 30 years. But it continues to grow fairly well at 5% or so. If China can continue to grow at 5%, at this point, for many companies, it's like recession because they got used to double-digit growth. 5% is recessionary. And over time, you adjust. If you can raise the quality of the growth, improve the environment and all that, it actually is a pretty decent situation. The challenge is to be able to adjust to that. Actually, China, and let me end by emphasizing how, for example, China has been investing significantly, for example, on the knowledge economy. 7.5 million people graduate from colleges each year today in China. That's 2.5 times as many as in the United States. And many people are forming companies and so on. And innovation-wise, China is actually, unlike many other countries, it has a lot of significantly competitive enterprises. They may not be the most innovative, but you guess where do they hire people? For example, Alibaba, which is not exactly an entirely fully Chinese company because it's owned by the Japanese, the Americans, and some Chinese investors. But it also knows to hire people from Google and so on. So that's the new China in that regard in terms of that sector. At the same time, however, some of the older industries, steel, cement, construction, they're in recession. So companies have to adjust, and the economy has to adjust. And likewise, for this matter, the governance has to adjust too. And that's also very interesting. So I have to end here. Thank you.